Greetings. Welcome to Avon Valley Church's Thought for the Day. My name is Jeremy. This glorious area has recently featured the New Forest deserted as never before and the River Avon brim full. But spring is bursting upon us, that season of new beginnings. Also, we are in Lent, the season when we review our progress along life's path and check that God within us is in harmony with God all about us. And we review our endeavours to make God's world a better place. In such reviews, it's sometimes helpful to consider how others fared in stressful times. In the church lectionary, we can look up and see who is especially remembered this week. And there's just one man, not a saint or a martyr, but a priest from about 100 years ago. He became famous in World War I. He was possibly Britain's greatest evangelist. His nickname was Woodbine Willie, after the cigarettes which he gave out so freely. But his real name was Geoffrey Studdert Kennedy. I first came across this remarkable man when a boy at school. Our headmaster, Thor Code, often preached on Sundays. Fortunately, some of his sermons were later published, so I can now refer to them. One Sunday, he referred to Studdert Kennedy in relation to understanding the Bible. He said, "The prologue to St. John's Gospel starts with verses which contain the heart of the whole matter. Jan will now remind us how John 1, those first few verses, how that reads.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of all the people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth.
Reverend Studdert Kennedy wrote, "There are no words that have ever been penned by the hand of mortal man which contain profounder wisdom than the opening of St. John's Gospel." After quoting these verses, Studdert Kennedy proceeded to explain their meaning. Right at the heart of ultimate reality, there was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end, a person expressing a rational purpose which all people can in some measure understand. Now, that's a cumbersome sentence, but Thor Code went on to unpack it. There's a purpose which we can realise if with heart, mind and soul we seek it. A pattern or a scheme of things which makes sense of our lives. God, our Creator, as the light of God, reveals his purpose to us. Each of us has a part to play in the drama of life. Our part is essential and significant in the great scheme of things. Our life needs to reflect God's love. And that thought has stayed with me always, and it was possibly the most profound thing that I learned at school. So Studdert Kennedy came into my life decades after his own life had ended. He was known by the fighting men in the trenches as Father Geoffrey. He was an Anglican priest who, in his 30s, shortly after World War I had started, enlisted as an army chaplain. He was soon inspiring the troops. A colleague described him thus: "He's an Irishman, as charming, amusing and eloquent as only an Irishman can be. He's a great gift to amuse, yet to deliver a powerful message to the men. One moment he has them in fits of laughter, the next moment he has hold of their heartstrings and is drawing them to Christ." Previously, as a vicar, he was well used to working with impoverished, hard-working folk, and he used the same salty language that they did. As well as being a preacher, he was also a writer of rough rhymes, as he called his verses. This one describes how the soldiers see themselves. "Our Padre, he says I'm a sinner, and John Bull, he says I'm a saint. And both of 'em's bound to be liars. I'm neither of 'em, I ain't. I'm a man, and a man's a mixture right from his very birth. For part of him comes from heaven, and part of him comes from earth. There's nothing in man that's perfect, and there's nothing that's all complete. He's no but a big beginning, from his head to the soles of his feet. There's summat that draws him upwards, and summat that drags him down. And the consequence is he wobbles twixt muck and a golden crown." He was not a great war poet, but his book of rough rhymes was massively popular and quickly sold out. It was reprinted time and time again. Father Geoffrey was soon moved to the front line on the Battle of the Somme. It was an incredibly bloody battle, with the highest casualty rate of all time. The men lived in the trenches, in the rain and the mud and the rats, and Father Geoffrey lived alongside them. He shared their meals, told jokes, sang songs, prayed for them, prayed with them, wrote letters home for some. Also, wherever he went, he gave out pocket New Testaments. But also, he gave out Will's Woodbine cigarettes. Woodbine cigarettes made by Will's. Hence his nickname, Woodbine Willie. When the whistle sounded, he was up and over the top with the men, out there amongst the bullets. He sought out the wounded, stayed with those dying, and later buried the dead. With his helpers, he got the wounded back to the trenches. He was devoted to the troops, and although an officer, he was as one with the men. One day a new officer came looking for him. "Have any of you chaps seen Captain Kennedy?" he asked. None of them had. "Have you seen the Padre?" he asked some others. "No, sir," they replied, "but a chap who might know is just along there. You go and ask Woodbine Willie, he'll know." That's how the men called him. Then the army and the church gave Geoffrey a new role. He was to be a full-time preacher, going to the camps just behind the front line. The church wanted him to preach repentance and hope for the future. The army wanted him to raise morale, reinforce patriotism, stimulate their fighting spirit, and he met all these requirements in his rousing sermons. Generally, he preached 3 times a day to between 500 and 1,500 people at a time. Some of the top brass thought that he was too familiar with the men, and they disapproved of his bawdy language. But the soldiers loved him. All agreed he was highly effective and totally fulfilled his brief. Years later, he criticised himself for being too jingoistic in these addresses. He also spoke of peace and individual freedom and fair play. He spoke against drunkenness and frequenting women of the street. "Look after your pals in your time off," he would say. "Help them not to be led astray. Enjoy a beer, but not a bucketful. Remember your girls back home. Be worthy of their respect." You might ask, what's the church doing here? Well, I'll tell you. we are trying to keep the hope of heaven alive in you in the midst of this bloody hell. Geoffrey loved the liturgy and ceremony of the church and celebrated Holy Communion each day. But he also spoke directly to the congregations and composed services using their language so all could find and love God just as he did. After a while, he was returned to the front line. At one point, in an advanced wound dressing station where he was working, they received a direct hit from a shell. Most of the troops there were killed instantly. Only Geoffrey, a doctor and 2 stretcher bearers survived. Amongst those killed were several close friends and colleagues. He later got all their bodies back to a cemetery just behind the lines. Burial services took up much of his time. Also, there were sad letters to write to their families. Once, near the town of Ypres, or Wipers, as his men called it, he was attending 20 wounded men in a forward bunker on the battlefield. They were in a bad way, urgently needing painkillers, drugs, bandages and so on. They were crying out for help. So ducking low, he ran to get it, diving into bomb craters as the enemy snipers spotted him. Against all odds, he got back to the trenches, got together the supplies, and successfully returned back to his wounded. For this, he was awarded the Military Cross, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. He showed great courage and disregard for his own safety in attending the wounded under heavy enemy fire. His cheerfulness and endurance had a splendid effect on all ranks in the front line trenches. Eventually, the tanks arrived, and Geoffrey was allowed a brief respite with a visit home to his beloved wife and their young son. He baptised his son at evensong the first Sunday he was home, in his own church, which was packed full. They'd got word that he was returned. He preached for over an hour, sitting on a table at the front of the nave. As the local paper reported, he told droll stories and graphically described events with pathos and humour, holding his audience spellbound. On his return to the front, he again was sent preaching, riding a horse from camp to camp. Remember, this was only 100 years ago. In 1918, the Allies broke through the German lines. Germany's allies, Austria and Turkey, both accepted armistices. The German Navy, already beaten by the British, now mutinied. The Kaiser abdicated. War ended on the 11th day of the 11th month at 11 a.m. Afterwards, Geoffrey was strongly against the so-called peace plan, the settlement that left Germany impoverished by war reparation payments. It'll surely lead to future conflict, he warned. How right he was. Early in 1919, he was demobbed and returned to his family and his parish. He was a great parish priest, but he also produced more books reflecting on the evils of war, and with the vision of a country at peace, with equal opportunity for all people. These books were very popular. His family's own lifestyle was extremely modest, with the full support and agreement of his wife. In 1920, he was honoured by being made an official chaplain to His Majesty the King. He now had a very busy lifestyle, as in addition to his parish duties, he was much in demand nationwide as a renowned speaker. As an example of his preaching style, he would sometimes begin, "I believe in God. Is your God Venus, or Bacchus, or Christ?" Geoffrey was a socialist in outlook, but he was strictly non-political. He always attracted great crowds, such was his fame and skill as an orator. His theme was that God is love, and mankind can relate to God's love, but should not do so for personal wealth or power or gain, nor should they try to relate to a regal God on a distant throne. The God for all people is God as shown in Christ. He wanted the church to be welcoming, uplifting, and attractive in every way. In 1921, Geoffrey and his family left his parish as he felt called to a wider brief. He was appointed the principal speaker to the Industrial Christian Ministry. It was held in high regard and had a mix of successful industrialists, bishops, and so on its board of directors. The Archbishop of Canterbury arranged for him to have the living of a London church to supplement his meagre income. He spoke at meetings all over Britain. Nationwide, he was Christ's champion, as famous as Billy Graham decades later. In 1924, he did a speaking tour of the USA and Canada. He continued preaching far and wide year after year. His wife and now his 3 sons accepted and supported his great but demanding calling as a national evangelist. Even though he was so stretched, he still found time to help out in his father's parish. His father remained a parish priest into his 80s. So God's calling was in Geoffrey's blood. The elder 2 of his sons went on to become priests. On his tours, his lifelong asthma troubled him, but it rarely stopped him. Then one day, in 1929, far from home, he caught pneumonia, and his condition quickly deteriorated. His wife was rushed to his bedside, but he died the next day. The nation recognised its great loss. He was laid in church and thousands filed past his coffin to pay their last respects. There was a popular move to have him buried in Westminster Abbey, but the Dean forbade it and was reported as saying, "We can't have a socialist here." His funeral was in Worcester Cathedral, with parallel services of remembrance held in London, Manchester, Liverpool, and in Wales. He loved God, and he loved people, and I feel sure that God loved him, and the people most certainly did too. His evangelical message changed so many people's lives through World War I and on through the year between the wars. That is why the Church particularly remembers him every year at this time. Father Geoffrey, alias Woodbine Willie, was a man with a message that still holds good today. God, who created the world, loves you. So, to fulfill your purpose, you should actively love God and shape your lives accordingly. Thank you for joining me and for sharing these thoughts for today. May God be with you.